Good morning and welcome to what is day 4 of Is Our Democracy in Danger? Once again, we've distributed the 4x6 cards for any questions you might have. Next week will be our last week, and I always like to get some feedback on the course. So I will be distributing an evaluation form this coming week electronically to those who have email and by Cubby for those who do not. I would ask you to bring it with you to class next week along with a pen or pencil so you can fill it out once we wrap up. We did have some questions and comments from last time, so let me turn to those. One person said, I noticed several people leaving class early. Is this due to their discomfort with the information being presented? Typically, it is about this third class when some folks become uncomfortable with the direction of the class. So it could be they are leaving in protest. But I also know some people needed to leave for an 11:30 memorial service. But since there were also a couple more other comments that suggested I am being one-sided or partisan, so I do not discount the walkouts. And let's look at those for a moment. Another person said, you were correct that the presentation might be seen as one-sided. However, there was much interesting information and much food for thought. If I am being one-sided, I hope to be on the side of democracy as opposed to authoritarian directions. And from this perspective, we should all be on the side of democracy. And yet I have the following comment. Your presentation is definitely partisan. You seek to discredit anyone who disagrees with the Democratic Party. I will not be attending any more lectures. This strikes at the heart of how difficult it is for me to be perceived as unbiased or fair. While I think I'm talking about democratic values, that is with a small d, and I seek to discredit those who do not support those values, my questioner clearly feels Democrats are getting too many positive strokes and Republicans are being demeaned. However, if the reality is that Republicans are really less supportive of democratic values, how else should this be reported? Now, next week, I will make the case that the Republican Party's commitment to democracy and democratic values is eroding. But in the meantime, we can easily see this erosion when Republican candidates and their supporters refuse to abide by the core democratic value of accepting the results of elections, win or lose. Am I discrediting Republicans by pointing out that their party is not accepting their losses, or am I simply stating a fact? Would it be more honest of me to describe each party as equally committed to democracy when one is clearly falling short? I think not. So moving on, we had a question about conservatives and what exactly are conservatives trying to conserve? White entitlement, 1950s America, economic security, religious dominance, some mix of the above. Can conservatives be accurately or clearly defined today? Now, I make a distinction between conservatives and the Republican Party because I'm pretty sure they are no longer the same thing. Conservatives have true values, the first being a commitment to democracy. Following that, they want policies supporting small government, little regulation, low taxation, strong defense, family values, public order, individual initiative, and good character. However, the new litmus test for members of the Republican Party is no longer a commitment to the conservative tradition, but loyalty to Donald Trump. Most true conservatives have either left the party or been banished. And next week, we will talk about how the Republican Party is evolving. And the final question I had was, how do we counter the trends of disinformation and polarization? And this is a big, big topic, and there are people writing books and treatises and theses on this, so I can't give you a quick answer. But if you search on Google, You should get enough information to occupy yourself for months. In fact, this past Wednesday, there was an article in the New York Times by Thomas Edsall titled, "Political Scientists Want to Know Why We Hate Each Other This Much." And it offers up many references to other source materials that could be helpful. So let's review a little bit. We began with talking about the value of democracy and provided some comparison to authoritarian forms of government. Then we talked about the elements or components that define a democracy, such things as voting rights, human rights, a constitution, the peaceful transfer of power, and the rule of law. But we learned a constitution is not enough because you cannot make up enough rules to govern every situation. What is required is accepted norms of appropriate behavior. We learned that politicians must do three things to be considered loyal to democracy: respect the outcome of elections, reject violence and the threat of violence, and reject those who represent anti-democratic forces. Democracies can be subverted, and it typically happens from within through capturing the referees, sidelining the opposition, and changing the rules of the game. Reviewing our democracy, we learned that the heart of democracy is elections and their ability to determine the will of the people. While voter participation is our biggest problem, it is baseless worries about election fraud that has captured the attention of many. Consequently, there are those taking action to intimidate and threaten our election officials, resulting in election resignations. We learned that vast amounts of money have been unleashed in our political system that bends our political system towards those with the money. Norms are the soft guardrails of democracy, and as they break down, the zone of acceptable political behavior expands, giving rise to discourse and action that degrade democracy. There are many historical reasons for increasing polarization, but we also learned that the social media is corrosive to trust in our democracy. Today, we will begin with a discussion of economic inequality and work our way through counter-majoritarian institutions, the rule of law, the peaceful transfer of power, and human rights and liberties. The intensity of polarization in America today reflects the combined effect not only of growing ideological divergence, but also rising economic inequality. The economic changes of the last few decades have driven an economic divide where the wealthy have done very well, but the not so wealthy have grown economically weaker. Economic inequality is reflected in both income inequality and wealth inequality. This chart shows how income inequality has grown since the 1980s. Income is defined as the dollars a person receives in a year. The top three lines on this chart represent the top 1/100%, the top 1/10%, and the top 1% when it comes to income growth. The bottom four lines represent everyone else. You can see how the income gains of the top earners have dwarfed the gains of low and middle income households. While there has been significant economic growth overall, those gains have not been shared equally. Now, this is not all bad. Income can be seen as the reward people receive for the businesses they have started and contributed to the overall growth of our economy. But the amount of variation still remains concerning. Wealth inequality is more problematic. Wealth is the financial assets, that is like real estate, stocks, that sort of thing, held by an individual. Again, this chart shows the top 1/100%, top 1/10%, and the top 1%. That's the top three lines. And they've done very well since the 1970s. The assets they hold continue to appreciate, so they grow wealthier and without much effort. Whereas you can see the bottom 50%, the bottom green line, actually lost wealth between 2007 and 2017. Wealth is different from income in that it can be passed on to the children. that is, those who did not build the initial business. For example, Sam Walton created Walmart and was well rewarded for it financially. However, his 6 children who were not involved in building the business now hold more wealth than the bottom 40% of our population combined, somewhere around 125.6 million people. More and more wealth seems to be concentrating among fewer and fewer people. It is common in most governments that the wealthy will have an outsized influence unless purposely restrained. In America, this was true in the early 1900s, but changed when the New Deal began to regulate businesses, provide a basic social safety net, and increase taxes on the wealthy. This dramatically reduced economic inequality and grew the national GDP by 250%. But business owners and executives grew frustrated with the regulatory binge of the 1960s. In 1971, soon-to-be Supreme Court Justice Lewis Powell was a leading corporate lawyer whose now famous Powell Memorandum proposed it was time for corporate America to fight back. A community of leading CEOs formed the Business Roundtable, an organization devoted explicitly to cultivating political influence. Many CEOs began hiring their first lobbyists, and they began winning, killing major labor law reforms, rolling back regulations, and lowering their taxes. Included in this effort was the deregulation of the financial sector, which led to less government oversight and many new financial products and services designed to benefit the wealthy. Additionally, those who worked in the financial sector experienced significant increases in wealth. Tax policy has become more favorable to the wealthy and corporations. For example, the top marginal tax rate has been cut from 70% in 1970 to 37% in 2022. Those tax cuts made it easier for the wealthy to accumulate wealth and more difficult for the government to redistribute wealth through taxes. These tax cuts for the wealthy have been and continue to be a major driver of the national debt. Unions played a major role in reducing income inequality in the post-war era by negotiating for higher wages and benefits for their members. However, the weakening of labor laws, the decline of manufacturing jobs, and other changes in the economy have resulted in a decline of union membership. Globalization has led to a decline in manufacturing jobs, which has hurt middle-class workers while benefiting those who are able to move into higher-paying jobs in the knowledge economy. Here is what Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis had to say about wealth inequality. He said, we may have democracy, or we may have wealth in the hands of a few, but we cannot have both. So why does economic inequality matter? Now, this rather fuzzy chart shows the relationship between economic inequality and polarization from 1947 to 2000. What you notice is they move together, and that is the problem. As economic inequality gets larger, so does political polarization. Generally, high economic inequality is recognized as something that is not healthy for a society. On the surface, it can lead to feelings of resentment and anger. The poor and the middle class may feel the wealth of society is being siphoned away from them. They are being treated unfairly, and that the system is rigged against them. This resentment can lead to social unrest and even violence. There are a number of studies that provide compelling evidence that economic inequality can contribute to the rise of what is referred to as white grievance. That is, racial resentment and negative attitudes towards immigration. While Americans who believe that inequality is unjust are more likely to believe that racial minorities and immigrants are benefiting from an unfair advantage. They tend to seek out a strong nationalist leader who promises to restore their lost status and privilege. But there is also some less obvious social costs associated with economic inequality. Richard Wilkinson is a professor emeritus of social epidemiology at the University of Nottingham, England, and has been studying the social impacts of economic inequality. His research drew attention to the tendency for societies with bigger income differences between rich and poor to suffer a heavier burden of a wide range of health and social problems. Here is what he discovered. There's an increase in mortality and morbidity. Societies with high levels of economic inequality have higher rates of death and disease. This is due to a number of factors, including stress, poor diet, and lack of access to health care. Reduced social mobility. Children born into poor families are less likely to succeed in life than children born into wealthy families. This is because they have less access to resources and opportunities. The American dream for many is less possible when there is significant economic inequality. Increased crime and violence. Societies with high levels of economic inequality have higher rates of crime and violence. This is because people who are struggling to make ends meet are more likely to turn to crime. Societies with high levels of economic equality have lower levels of trust and social cohesion. This is because people who are divided by wealth are less likely to feel connected to each other. People who live in societies with high levels of economic inequality are less satisfied with their lives. This is because they are more likely to feel stressed, anxious, and depressed. Economic inequality leads to something called representational bias, the tendency for the government to be more responsive to the interests of the wealthy than the poor. We touched on this subject last week with Professor Lessig's explanation of tweedism and how the government becomes responsive to the wealthy. Dr. Lessig referenced the groundbreaking work of Martin Gilens and Ben Page. In their 2014 study, they determined what gets done in Congress correlates highly with the preferences of the wealthy. That is, economic elites and interest groups are the ones who shape U.S. government policy. Americans who are less well off have essentially no influence over what their government does. This is primarily because the wealthy individuals and organizations make significant contribution to the campaigns of candidates for Congress, and this gives them significant amount of influence over the candidate's position on issues. And wealthy individuals and organizations hire lobbyists to influence the legislative process. Lobbyists have access to lawmakers and can use their influence to shape legislation in ways and benefits their clients. But also, over 80% of the wealthiest Americans are registered to vote, compared to only 22% of the poorest Americans. This gives them a greater voice in the political process. Wealthy people are more likely to live in the swing states. This gives them a greater influence over the outcome of elections. Now, this can lead to what has been referred to as a doom loop oligarchy, where wealth buys power, more power buys more wealth means more power means more wealth, and on we go until a very small fraction of the population has a whole lot of the money and a whole lot of the power. Now let's talk about some institutional aspects of our government that impact our ability to maintain a democracy. The United States has formed a political system that makes it more difficult for a law to pass than just about any other democracy in the world. To take effect, a legislative proposal needs to garner a majority of the House of Representatives, a supermajority in the Senate, the approval of the President, and the assent of the Supreme Court. The slowness of operations tends to frustrate those who are not rooted in the checks and balances of a democracy. Typically, this is a populist outsider who rails against the do-nothing system and promises to fix things. Consequently, when populists win, they often assault democratic institutions. As mentioned on day one, decisions in a democracy are made by majority rule, and everyone is bound by them. And a majority means 50% plus one. Any institution where decisions are made by something besides a majority are referred to as counter-majoritarian. We have some elements of our system that are like that, so it is important that we understand these. Specifically, the Electoral College, how the Senate represents us, the filibuster, and gerrymandering. But also how the Constitution does not make it easy to fix the counter-majoritarian institutions defined within it. We will then talk about the peaceful transfer of power and the rule of law. Let's start with the Electoral College. I suspect we have all heard of it, but let's learn more about it.
If you watch the news during a presidential election, you'll hear a lot of this.
What do the national polls look like?
Hillary Clinton's nationally, Joe Biden is currently ahead.
But these national polls don't actually tell you who's going to win.
Throw the national polls out the window. They don't matter at all. What matters are those swing states.
Ah, yes, the swing states. Most democracies around the world elect their head of state with a popular vote, so whoever gets the most votes wins. But in America, we do it a little differently. The US is the only country that picks its president using something called the Electoral College. It's made up of delegates from each US state. When Americans vote for president, what they're actually voting for is who their state will vote for. This is why, every so often, someone wins the presidency without winning the popular vote. That's happened twice in just the past 20 years. The majority of Americans do not like the system, and haven't for a long time. Both political parties have made attempts to get rid of it. So why does the US still use the Electoral College? And who actually benefits from it? The Electoral College is based on how people are represented in Congress, where each state has a number of representatives based on its population, and every state also gets 2 senators. So, for example, let's look at Texas, which has a huge population, and Vermont, which has a really small one. Texas has 36 representatives in Congress. Vermont only gets 1. Representatives in both states each represent roughly the same number of people. In the Electoral College, a state gets the same number of delegates as their congressional representatives, plus 2 for each senator. So Texas has 38 electoral votes, Vermont has 3. But this combination makes the number of people each delegate represents way different between states. In Texas, 1 electoral delegate represents 3 times the amount of people as 1 in Vermont. And that makes each individual person's vote in Vermont a lot more influential. The Electoral College creates discrepancies like this all over the country. A voter in Wyoming is worth 3.5 times as much as a voter in California. And the winner of the presidential election is the candidate who gets 270 or more of these Electoral College votes. These are the results of the 2016 election by state. You're probably more familiar with this version of it, a map of red states and blue states. But this chart tells a different story. You can see that no state is actually all red or all blue. But almost every state awards its electoral votes the same way. The candidate who gets the most votes in a state gets all its electoral votes. If they win the state by 1%, they win 100% of the electoral votes. In 2016, more than 4 million people voted for Donald Trump in California. In fact, more people voted for him there than in any other state except for 2. But it didn't matter. Hillary Clinton got more votes there, so she got all 55 of its electoral votes. Clinton never even campaigned in California. Polling showed she'd easily win the state. Trump only visited Texas once. He knew he'd basically had that state's electoral votes locked. But they both visited Florida 35 or more times. That's because Florida is usually a swing state. Polls show that the vote there could swing to one party or another nearly every election. Trump only won it in 2016 by 100,000 votes, out of more than 9 million. Swing states have changed over time thanks to shifting demographics and political views, and it's states like these where presidential candidates spend most of their time campaigning. It also means these states have way more influence over the election than these ones. A study found that voters in Michigan had 51 times the amount of influence on the 2016 election as someone from a state like Utah. Voters in states like California or Missouri mattered very little. Swing states are where the election actually takes place. They get the attention and the influence, and they only exist because of the Electoral College. It doesn't seem very fair, but the Electoral College has always shifted power away from some people and towards others. It was how it was designed. Back when there were just a few states, not 50, they had to get all the states to agree on the Constitution. One problem. The northern states, which were largely anti-slavery, wanted only free people to count in the population towards electoral votes, which they had more of. The pro-slavery southern states were worried that they would be constantly outvoted and wanted enslaved people to count in determining the population. As a compromise, they settled on something called the 3/5 Clause. It established that an enslaved person would only count as 3/5 of a person. In 1800, Pennsylvania, a northern state, and Virginia, a southern one, had about the same number of free people living there, but Virginia was also home to hundreds of thousands of enslaved people who had no freedom, let alone a vote, and ended up with more votes in the Electoral College than Pennsylvania. That year, those extra electoral votes gave the candidate from Virginia just enough to win. Even after the U.S. finally abolished slavery and eventually gave Black Americans the right to vote, white Southern leaders found ways to keep them from voting, like with discriminating laws like poll taxes and acts of violence. This meant they continued to have overrepresentation in the Electoral College on behalf of a large population that couldn't vote. The first time Congress attempted to replace the Electoral College with a simple popular vote was back in 1816, but senators from southern states blocked it, saying it would be deeply injurious to them. In 1969, Congress came even closer. Replacing the Electoral College had support in both parties and even passed the House, but it was blocked again by southern senators. A senator from Alabama wrote, "The Electoral College is one of the South's few remaining political safeguards. Let's keep it. Why change a system that historically had and still was benefiting white Southerners?" Today, the states that the Electoral College benefits have changed, but it's still making some voters more powerful than others. If we look at the states with a lot of electoral votes for not a lot of people, and the states with a little electoral votes for a lot of people, these states are a lot wider and less diverse than the rest of America. And many of these states are Republican strongholds. These tend to vote Democratic. That's one reason the two most recent Republican presidents have won the Electoral College without winning the popular vote. And since it's currently Democrats that are primarily disadvantaged by the Electoral College, they're the ones leading the charge to replace it with a popular vote.
Get rid of the Electoral College and everybody.
But as politics have changed, the people most critical of the Electoral College have too. In the 1948 presidential election, New York ended up being the major swing state. A congressman from Texas said, "I have no objection to the Negro in Harlem voting, but I do resent the fact that his vote is worth 100 times as much as the vote of a white man in Texas." Swing states change. What doesn't is that the Electoral College gives certain people more power to pick the president. And its biggest defenders have always been those who benefit the most from it.
So Al Gore won the popular vote by 500,000 votes and lost. Hillary Clinton won the popular vote by 3 million votes and lost. Joe Biden won the popular vote by 7 million votes and came within about 44,000 votes in a few critical swing states of also losing. It appears the discrepancy between the winner of the popular vote and the winner of the Electoral College is getting larger. University of Texas political scientists estimated in 2019 that in a 50-50 popular vote election, the Republican candidate had a 65% chance of winning the Electoral College. And the number of competitive swing states in 2024 is projected to be similar than ever, comprising just 6 states: Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. This represents 15% of the country's population, leaving 85% of Americans with little incentive to vote for the nation's highest office. Now, some say that the Electoral College is just the way we do things, but how big a popular vote discrepancy does there have to be before the outcome of the election is seen as illegitimate? How long before citizens start saying the election does not reflect our will? Many democracies around the world had something similar to the Electoral College as part of their election machinery. However, during the 20th century, every other presidential democracy in the world discarded that system in favor of direct elections. America remains the outlier with an intact Electoral College. Only in America can a president be elected against the majority's expressed vote. And the impact of the Electoral College goes beyond just the selection of the president. The president also makes nominations to the Supreme Court. Interestingly, in 7 of the last 8 presidential elections, Democrats won the popular vote, but that was not enough to give them control of the Supreme Court. 5 of the 6 conservative justices on the Supreme Court were seated by presidents who lost the popular vote. That is George Bush and Donald Trump. Donald Trump was actually able to make more appointments in 1 term than Barack Obama was able to make in 2. The worry is that the Supreme Court will not reflect the views of the average American. The common response is that the justice should not care. They are not there to satisfy the majority or be swayed by the shifting winds of public opinion. But historically, the court comes down close to where the American people are, so the court has been seen as fair and legitimate. But what happens if the majority of Americans do not see the court as fair or see it as partisan? As of May 2020, this worry seemed unwarranted. According to a Pew Research Center poll, 70% of Americans held a favorable view of the court. A Harvard study queried 2,000 citizens to determine how well the decisions of the court aligned with public opinion. The study showed that in 2019 term, the court's position in every major case was exactly in line with public opinion. However, following a series of high-profile rulings addressing such issues as abortion, affirmative action, LGBTQ rights, and student loans, the share of Americans with a favorable opinion of the U.S. Supreme Court dropped in 3 years from 70% to 44%, its lowest point in public opinion surveys dating back to 1987. At the same time, the court is being touched by the overall lack of trust in our institutions. A Gallup poll from last fall found that only 49% of Americans had a great deal or a fair amount of trust in the Supreme Court. That 49% trust reading comes on the heels of the 47% record low in 2022. Before 2022, trust in the judicial branch averaged around 68%. Now, some of this goes back to norms. You may remember that Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell refused to allow President Obama's nomination, Merrick Garland, a hearing when nominated in March of 2016. McConnell's justification was his commitment to a newly discovered democratic principle that no seat should be filled in a presidential election year. The people should be given a chance to weigh in. So he held that vacancy open until Donald Trump took office in 2017 and filled it with Neil Gorsuch. In 2020, he ignored that principle when he rushed to confirm Amy Coney Barrett to replace Ruth Bader Ginsburg. The vote on Barrett took place 8 days before Election Day. Now, McConnell may not have been serious in his justification, but nothing he did was against the rules. It was only a radical departure from historical norms. This was just one more example of norm erosion growing out of political tribalism, where the opposition is seen as so bad they cannot be allowed to win. This norm erosion may also be affecting the perceived legitimacy of the Supreme Court. An interesting side note on the Supreme Court, as that it can be seen as a counter-majoritarian institution on its own merits due to our judges having lifetime appointments. Lifetime tenure results in what is called intergenerational counter-majoritarianism. That is, present-day majorities may be thwarted by justices appointed decades ago. Curiously, America is the only democracy in the world with lifetime tenure for Supreme Court justices. Even our own states have replaced lifetime tenure with either term limits or a mandatory retirement age for high court justices. So far, efforts to address this problem have been modest. Now, here is an issue that most of us are not aware of. When the Constitution was being debated, there was always a concern about too much democracy and the passions of the majority. The Senate was designed to counterbalance the directly elected House of Representatives with a more deliberative body. It was intended to represent the states as opposed to the people. So no matter what the population of the state, each state got 2 senators. This is becoming a problem, and here is a video that explains why.
In the United States, every citizen has, technically, the right to have their voice represented in Congress. But not every vote is equal. Take a look at this. This is the population of California, the biggest in the country. And this is the population of Wyoming, the smallest. But in the US Senate, this is how many representatives they each have. 2. California actually has the same population as these 22 states combined, meaning that while these 39 million people have 2 senators, these 39 million people get 44. While the presidential election always takes up the most attention, the Senate is where a president's policies and laws can be passed or blocked. This is the first part in our series looking at you versus the system. We'll be diving into how American political and financial systems work against you and sometimes your vote. So let's look at why the US Senate is the way it is and what can be done to make it more fair. The federal government is divided into the executive, judicial, and legislative branches. Laws are passed here, in the 2 houses of Congress. The House of Representatives has 435 members, each one representing around the same number of people across the country. As we've seen, though, the Senate has only 100 members, 2 per state, regardless of how many people live in those states. This system was designed at the Constitutional Convention in 1787, where the U.S. Constitution was drawn up.
The main point of contention at the convention in terms of representation was whether the legislature would reflect sort of population differences between the larger and the smaller states, or whether all the states would be represented equally.
So they came up with a compromise. 2 legislatures, one to represent the people and one to represent the states.
So the larger states get more representation in the House and the smaller states get less. And then they created this second body. The US Senate is, the principle is equal representation for the states.
That makes sense when you think about how, back then, the political divide was between states, not political parties like it is today.
One of the biggest problems is malapportionment. That is, the extent to which the representatives represent the same number of people. And the US Senate is actually the most malapportioned legislative body on the face of the earth.
That malapportionment is also demographic. The smallest, most overrepresented states are whiter, while the larger, more underrepresented states are more ethnically diverse. And that has real consequences because the Senate passes laws and it confirms presidential nominees, including cabinet members, ambassadors, and, importantly, Supreme Court justices. But we'll get to that in a bit. For now, think about this.
If you add up the population of the 26 smallest states, and they can control 52 seats in the Senate, that represents 18% of the population. Right? So it's possible for a political majority to emerge in the Senate that represents less than 1/5 of the American people.
Basically, you can win a majority in the Senate while only winning a minority of voters nationally. And that has a big effect on how the US is governed.
This era that we're in, where we have really strong partisanship, means that the Senate can be a place where a political minority sort of clings to power and thwarts progress that maybe the political majority would like to make.
That's why popular progressive policy ideas like the Green New Deal, a wealth tax, legalizing marijuana, a $15 an hour minimum wage, free college, and so on have so much trouble becoming law. So whether Joe Biden or Donald Trump wins the presidential election in 2020, the way they would govern will be shaped by who controls the Senate. But the Senate doesn't just grant a minority blocking power over legislation and give more weight to some people's votes over others. It denies some Americans any say at all. Washington, D.C.'s license plates say taxation without representation, and with good reason. D.C. has just over 700,000 residents, more than Wyoming and Vermont, and just a few less than Alaska and North Dakota. Puerto Rico, meanwhile, is home to more than 3 million Americans. That's more than the population of 20 different states. But the two territories have not been granted statehood, meaning the total number of U.S. senators for D.C. and Puerto Rico is 0. And the Senate has one more rule that's used to check popular policy ideas. Almost every bill needs a supermajority of 60 votes to pass. It's not enough to have more votes than the other side. You need a lot more votes.
The supermajority requirements in the U.S. Senate, I think, breed a lot of cynicism and hopelessness about American politics, because frequently you see either Democrats or Republicans, they take the presidency, they take the House, and they take the Senate, and they still can't get anything done, because it's very rare for Democrats or Republicans to control 60 votes in the U.S. Senate.
Now let's step back to this. Unlike the president or Congress, Supreme Court judges aren't elected. They're appointed for life by the president and confirmed by the Senate. Their decisions shape laws on voting rights, the right of workers to unionize, reproductive rights, who can finance elections. That's why in 2016, the Republican-controlled Senate wouldn't let President Obama nominate Merrick Garland, his candidate for the Supreme Court. This kept a Supreme Court seat vacant, and that strategy paid off when Trump became president and nominated conservative judge Neil Gorsuch for the open position. The Senate, still controlled by Republicans, confirmed Gorsuch and then the following year confirmed Brett Kavanaugh. Following the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Amy Coney Barrett is likely to become the third conservative justice to join the Supreme Court under President Trump. That would cement the court's conservative character for decades to come. So we've established that the Senate doesn't count everyone's vote equally, shuts out millions of Americans, can be controlled by a small minority of voters, has a built-in mechanism for blocking popular legislation, and can, through the Supreme Court, shape laws far into the future.
This overrepresentation in the Senate by Republicans from rural areas is a problem for Democratic representation. For example, 15 small states with 41 million people combined routinely elect 30 GOP senators. California, with 39 million residents, is represented by only 2 Democrats. At no time during the 21st century have Senate Republicans represented a majority of the U.S. population, but they have controlled the Senate about half the time. Sparsely populated states representing less than 20% of the U.S. population can produce a Senate majority, and states representing 11% of the population can produce enough votes to block legislation via a filibuster. The inability of the Senate to reflect the popular will may eventually cause citizens to question the legitimacy of the system. And like the Electoral College, we are an international outlier. America is one of the few remaining democracies with a chamber so out of whack because it is putting a thumb on the scale for sparsely populated rural areas over highly populated urban areas. By 2040, it is projected that 70% of the people will live in 15 states. These states have the largest cities, representing 2/3 of the U.S. GDP and the most diverse populations. In other words, we will end up with 30 senators representing 70% of an urban, diverse, high GDP population, and 70 senators representing a rural, white, stagnating 30% of the population. Now, the Senate was originally designed to represent the states, not the people, so in theory, this should not matter. At its inception, this design was recognized as anti-democratic, but since it did not have a partisan effect, there was little concern. Today, it is still undemocratic, but due to the population shifts from rural areas to urban areas, there is definitely a partisan effect. If the legislation desired by the majority is consistently thwarted by the minority, this would seem to be a problem for legislative achievement as well as for democratic legitimacy. We talked earlier about how the very structure of our government makes passing legislation very difficult. So allowing a minority view to dominate would seem to make things even more difficult. If one party is consistently winning the popular vote, but not winning enough seats to implement their agenda, this would seem to be a serious problem. The purpose of equal state representation in the Senate is to ensure small rural states would not be dominated by the large urban states. But does that mean that the rural states should be able to dominate the urban states? And the effort to fix this is substantial because the Constitution specifies that no amendment can deny a state equal representation in the Senate without the state's consent. What state will voluntarily agree to such a change when they so clearly benefit from things as they are? If we have a constitutional provision that are excessively counter-majoritarian and proving a drag on our democracy, why do we not amend the Constitution? Among democracies, the U.S. Constitution is the hardest in the world to change. It requires supermajorities in 2 legislative chambers, plus the approval of 3/4 of the states. Consequently, the United States has one of the lowest rates of constitutional change in the world. There have been 11,848 attempts to amend the Constitution, but only 27 of them have been successful. The last time was in 1992, more than 3 decades ago. Compare that to Norway, who has amended their constitution 316 times in 200 years. Like the United States, Norway's original constitution contained a number of counter-majoritarian features. Unlike the United States, Norway was able to modify their constitution to better reflect changes in society and global norms. The result of all this reform is that Norway has been transformed into one of the most democratic countries on the earth, according to Freedom House's Global Freedom Index. Typically, Norway is rated near 100, whereas the United States tend to languish in the low 80s. It would seem that if a country is to continue to renew itself as a democracy, it must be able to respond to new understandings of what it means to be a democracy. At a minimum, it should not be protecting or empowering a partisan minority. That means being able to more easily make amendments to the Constitution. The previous video mentions a requirement for a supermajority in the Senate to pass legislation. The Senate rule that enforces this is called the filibuster. While the filibuster is a Senate rule and not enshrined in the Constitution, it is a classic counter-majoritarian institution that allows a minority of senators to prevent legislation from coming to a vote. I mentioned it a lot in our discussion of norm breaking, but here is a video that explains it.
These 100 people are the U.S. Senate. They pass laws. They vote, and when a majority says yes, it passes. But these days, the Senate doesn't do that very often.
The Senate holding 2 votes, both failed.
It's completely dysfunctional.
4 versions of gun control proposals, and all 4 failed.
See, the Senate has this rule. It says before they vote, 60 people have to agree to have the vote. That means just 41 people, a minority, can entirely block a bill. This is called a filibuster. Early on, filibusters were rare. This is a chart of the number of times the Senate has had a vote to break a filibuster in the last 100 years. But in the last 50 years, they started to grow, and now almost every big bill is filibustered. The U.S. Senate is broken, and the filibuster broke it. But the Senate didn't always have this rule. In fact, it all kind of happened by accident. This is the Senate in 1805. It's much smaller than it is now, and the filibuster as we know it today doesn't exist yet. And before they vote on a bill, they debate. If they want to end debate and vote, they just need a majority to agree. But Vice President Aaron Burr thinks a high-minded place like the Senate should have as much debate as needed. So the Senate gets rid of the rule. Now senators can debate for as long as they want, and there's no way to stop them. This is the beginning of the Senate filibuster. At first, it isn't really a problem. Because the Senate is still pretty small, there's only so long a group of senators can physically talk. Eventually they tire out, debate ends, and they get to a vote. But as the US grows, so does the Senate, and they have more factions and more people to filibuster bills. They move to a bigger room, and now it's 1917. World War I is underway, but the US isn't involved. Then President Woodrow Wilson asks Congress to authorize a broad military action. A group of senators don't want to give Wilson the power to enter the war, so they decide to debate until the session ends, filibuster. Woodrow Wilson is mad, and he demands that they go back to the old Senate rules. The debate can be ended with a simple majority. The Senate doesn't want to do that, so instead they compromise. They change the rules so they can end debate with the approval of 2/3 of the Senate, so that if senators want to block a bill, they need a third to do it. This is basically the system we have today. A supermajority to agree to vote, then a simple majority to pass a law. And for a few decades, the filibuster is used, but pretty sparingly. Then in the 1950s, the Senate starts to consider civil rights legislation, and Southern senators really hate this. But they don't have the votes to actually defeat the bills, so they start using the filibuster to block bills. Here's South Carolina Senator Strom Thurmond. He looks tired because he just filibustered the 1957 Civil Rights Act for more than 24 hours. These filibusters are painstaking, and they block the Senate from actually doing work. The majority leader at the time, Mike Mansfield, doesn't like this. He's okay with needing a supermajority to pass things. What he doesn't like are these long, pointless speeches. So he makes a change. He skips the debate and goes directly to a vote to see if there's a supermajority to end debate. This means if senators want to filibuster, they don't have to stand up and talk. They can just threaten to, as long as they have the numbers to block a supermajority vote. This makes it way easier to filibuster. And the number of filibusters grows. In the mid-70s, the Senate changes the threshold needed to filibuster. Now instead of 34 senators, you need 41, but it doesn't make much of a difference. And then around the 2000s, senators in the minority start to realize something. They can gain more politically by fighting than by cooperating. So they filibuster everything the other party wants to do. That's what leads to this spike. Now, almost every big bill is filibustered. Finally, in 2013, the Democratic majority makes a change to the rules that says the filibuster no longer applies to certain confirmation votes. In 2017, the Republican majority makes another similar change. Both times, it feels like a huge deal. But now, things are beginning to change. The 2020 elections are coming up, and Democrats have some big proposals.
Healthcare in America.
Federal investment in teachers' salaries.
Investments in clean energy.
But Democrats know even if they have a majority in the Senate, they're not going to get the 60 votes needed to overcome a filibuster. And that's why a new idea is now on the table.
Would you urge the Senate Democratic leader to get rid of the filibuster?
I think we have to have that on the table.
To get rid of the filibuster.
Get rid of the filibuster.
Getting rid of an old tradition naturally feels radical. But here's one more story about the filibuster. The Senate is only one half of Congress. The other half, the House of Representatives, also used to have rules that allow the minority party to filibuster bills. Then, in 1888, Republicans won control of the House, but the filibuster rules kept them from actually passing anything. It was like the election, and ultimately the will of the people didn't even matter. So, they got rid of it. And the reasoning was pretty simple. If the party that loses an election can block the winners from doing anything, what does it mean to be a democracy?
So if you're in the minority, it feels pretty good to know that you can block something that you absolutely hate, or if you feel your views have been ignored. Keeping the majority from running roughshod over a minority that is feeling disrespected or mistreated seems a reasonable way to protect minority rights. But that is quite different from allowing the minority to prevent the majority from taking any action. When one party has won the majority, they should be able to implement their agenda. This goes back to our discussion on norms of forbearance, that even though you have the institutional power to filibuster, it should be used sparingly. Because it has not been used that way, we are now faced with a tyranny of the minority. According to Stephen Litsky, a co-author of How Democracies Die, he says we are far and away the most counter-majoritarian democracy in the world. Due to the effects of these counter-majoritarian institutions, the Electoral College, rule domination of the Senate, and the filibuster, America risks descending into minority rule, an unusual and undemocratic situation in which a party wins fewer votes than its rivals, nevertheless maintains control over key levers of political power. Gerrymandering. Gerrymandering is about drawing election districts in each state. It is not really part of the Constitution, but it is possible because the Constitution assigns to the states the responsibility for running elections and drawing election districts. It is common for those who control the state legislatures to draw the districts in such a way as to benefit their own party. It is considered anti-democratic, but because it allows the politicians to select their voters rather than the voters selecting their politicians. So let's learn how this works.
In 2018, Americans voted for who would represent them in Congress. But in North Carolina, the election results were really weird. These squares represent all the voters in North Carolina. They were voting for these 13 seats in Congress. About half voted for Republicans, and about 48% voted for Democrats. So you might think of the 13 congressional seats, maybe Democrats would have won 6 seats, and Republicans would have won 7. But no, Democrats only won 3 of 13 seats, way less than half. This imbalance was because North Carolina's congressional districts had been gerrymandered. It means that these voters had been grouped into districts very strategically with the goal of benefiting one party. Gerrymandering has pretty much always happened in America. That's because every 10 years, the political districts are redrawn. And in most cases, those new lines get drawn by whoever holds power in state government at the time. That's what happened in 2010. Republicans won control of lots of state governments and redrew the political lines to favor themselves. And over the next few years, redistricting helped them hold on to almost all those states. This shifted the balance of power. And it turns out behind a lot of this was one guy.
Usually the voters get to pick the politicians. In redistricting, the politicians get to pick the voters.
This is Thomas Hofeller, the mapmaker who helped Republicans gerrymander districts over the last decade. When Hofeller died in 2018, his daughter found thousands of his emails and files, which she shared with activists. The files show that Tom Hofeller's fingerprints are all over the way America's political maps look today. But North Carolina was his masterpiece. And if you want to understand why gerrymandering is such a big problem in the US, that's a good place to start. The basics of gerrymandering are actually pretty simple. If you're a Republican trying to keep power, you want to do 2 things. First, pack as many Democratic voters as possible into a single district. If you have a district where almost everyone votes Democrat, that means almost half these votes are basically wasted. You can also crack big Democratic areas into separate districts where there are slightly more Republicans. So even though an area has a lot of Democratic votes, they would actually lose in this district and in this district. These are the 2 elements of classic gerrymandering, packing and cracking. And Hofeller employed these techniques masterfully in North Carolina. In 2011, he was hired to redraw the state's political lines, and for congressional districts, he came up with this map. Now I just want to focus in on District 12, this weird skinny shape. In order to make sense of this shape, we have to look at another map. This map shows the percentage of Black people in each neighborhood. The bluer areas are where more Black people live. Hoffler basically gathered up black people in Winston-Salem, Greensboro, and Charlotte and packed them into one district. So that's how District 12 happened. Hoffler also did this with North Carolina state representatives and state senators. For example, here are the state senate districts. Here, he packed Winston-Salem into one district, and then packed Greensboro into its own district. These new districts helped Republicans get a stranglehold on power in the North Carolina State House. And over the next few years, they were able to pass crucial legislation.
A strict new voter ID law in North Carolina.
Which bathrooms transgender individuals can use in North Carolina.
In 2016 and 2017, federal courts ruled that both of these maps were unconstitutional. They said what North Carolina Republicans did wasn't just gerrymandering, it was racial gerrymandering, done to deliberately dilute the political power of black people. The court said the Republicans in the North Carolina State House now had to redraw the lines without looking at racial demographics. So, they went back to Tom Hoffler. This time, Hoffler couldn't look at race. Instead, he looked at which areas voted for Democrats and which areas voted for Republicans. Instead of a racial gerrymander, it would be a partisan gerrymander. Here's that map, using data from 2014. The bluer an area, the more Democratic voters there are. Now, if you zoom in here to Greensboro, you can see one of the highest concentrations of Democratic voters in the state. Hoffler drew a congressional district line to crack this community in half. This meant Democrats here were now in the minority in their district, and Democrats here were also in the minority in their district. Hoffler employed these techniques all over the state to create North Carolina's new political districts. And the first big test for these new maps would be the 2018 election. Democrats were expected to turn out in droves.
Democrats are vying for a potential blue wave.
The wave that Republicans fear is going to wipe them out.
So, how do the maps do? For state representatives, Democrats got 51% of the vote. They only won 46% of seats. For state senate, they received half the vote and won just 42% of seats. And for Congress, you already know how that one turned out. Democrats won nearly half the votes, but won only 3 out of 13 seats. A year later in 2019, the Supreme Court weighed in. They said it was beyond their reach, that it wasn't their job to fix it. All of this raised an existential question. If Republicans could continue drawing the lines to stay in power, how could they ever be elected out of office? But the Supreme Court's ruling left open the possibility for state courts to rule on partisan gerrymandering. And in September 2019, that's exactly what North Carolina's Supreme Court did. The court found that partisan gerrymandering violated the state constitution. In the court's decision, it was Hoffler's files that helped prove that North Carolina Republicans drew these lines with a clear intention of benefiting themselves. Ultimately, the court said North Carolina Republicans had to redraw the state House and state Senate maps one more time. This new map, approved by North Carolina legislators, is much less biased toward one party, even though it took some extreme measures and nearly a decade to force politicians to draw a fair map. In the last few years, the courts in several states, like Florida and Pennsylvania, have made partisan gerrymandering much harder. And now that's also the case in North Carolina. Hoffler is gone now, but in other states across the country, many maps he helped draw are still in use. And while there's now a clearer strategy to challenge those maps in state courts, many voters are still effectively not choosing their representatives. It's like Hoffler said, the representatives are choosing the voters.
Of course, redistricting is democracy at work. Redistricting is like an election in reverse.
Interestingly, the North Carolina case referred to in the video where the state court overruled the gerrymandered districts concluded last summer with a Supreme Court decision that caused a sigh of relief among democracy advocates. The North Carolina legislature had appealed to the Supreme Court, advocating a fringe reading of the U.S. Constitution, where the word legislature meant only the elected body of representatives had the authority to make election rules. So neither the governor, nor the courts, nor citizen initiatives had any role in election rulemaking. The North Carolina legislature was claiming the U.S. Constitution gave them the right to gerrymander if they wanted to, and the state court did not have the authority to stop them. But luckily, the Supreme Court refused that interpretation and accepted the long-running understanding that the word legislature refers to each state's general lawmaking processes. So if a state constitution allows legislation to be blocked by a governor's veto, a state court, or a citizen referendum, election laws can be blocked in the same way. What made everyone nervous was that the Supreme Court even took up this case, since there was no meaningful difference of opinion among the lower courts that the Supreme Court needed to resolve. To be clear, gerrymandering is not an official part of our election process. It is simply permitted because the power to draw election districts for federal as well as state elections is vested by the U.S. Constitution in the state legislatures. So if one party has the majority in a legislature, it is common for them to ensure their own power by drawing their state house and Senate districts to benefit their party. If done well, a party that is actually a minority among the state voters can still maintain majorities in the legislature. But there is nothing that requires the legislature itself to draw the districts. Some states have delegated that power to a nonpartisan commission as the means of drawing fairer and more competitive districts. Currently, there are 9 states, and Colorado being one of them, that have delegated the power to draw districts to a nonpartisan commission. Overall, Democrats and Republicans are equally likely to engage in this anti-democratic behavior if they have the power to do it. However, Republicans have historically proved themselves more skilled at this. Republicans caught Democrats flat-footed in the redistricting that followed the 2010 census when they implemented a powerful plan called Red Map to increase Republican control of congressional seats as well as state legislatures. The project made effective use of sophisticated new mapping software to improve the precision with district lines are strategically drawn to favor their candidates. This definitely advantaged Republicans up until the next census in 2020. Democrats had been railing against gerrymandering as unfair and unethical, but once the Supreme Court ruled in 2019 that partisan gerrymandering claims cannot be heard by federal courts, Democrats realized that refusing to gerrymander would have meant effective unilateral disarmament in the battle for control over the House. However, state courts continue to pester both parties for fairer maps, and gerrymandering in one state seems to be offset by gerrymandering by the other party in another state. Consequently, Democrats have managed to fight Republicans to a draw, and the system now awards House seats fairly between the parties, not in every state, but nationally. So, for example, in 2022, Republicans won 51% of the popular vote nationally across all House districts. If seats were allocated strictly proportionally, they would have received 224 seats. In actuality, they ended up with 222 seats, which is pretty darn close. So despite our polarized politics, gerrymandering has become less of an issue in the outcome of congressional races. In the last 3 congressional races, gerrymandering produced no significant advantage for either party. Where it continues to play an outsized role is in the state legislatures themselves. So the rule of law. A constitutional democracy stands or falls with the effectiveness and trustworthiness of the system through which laws are created and enforced. If there are fundamental doubts about those institutions, then constitutional democracy as a whole is in trouble. This is brought to the forefront with Donald Trump's recent conviction on 34 felony counts of falsifying business records. Trump's allies have been furiously attacking the judge, the jury, the prosecutors, all elements of the justice system, because they did not like the outcome. Not accepting the outcome of our judicial process is the same as denying the results of free and fair elections. It is an assault on the fundamentals of our democratic system. While denying the outcome of our judicial process is a serious problem, another aspect of the rule of law Also of significant concern is that according to nearly every measure of both beliefs and actual incidents of political violence is considered more acceptable than it was 5 years ago. The rule of law says we manage political change through our political institutions, not by violence and intimidation, but here we are. Researchers have been tracking opinions on threats, harassment, and political violence since 2017. After the 2020 election, 20% of Republicans and 13% of Democrats agreed that political violence is justified for advancing the political goals of their party. A 2023 poll conducted by the Public Religion Research Institute and the Brookings Institution found 26% of white evangelicals agreed that, quote, true American patriots might have to resort to violence in order to save the country. And it may be that violence and threats are becoming normalized. Workers at the FBI, the IRS, Homeland Security, the CDC, and the National Archives are all being threatened. Public health workers are receiving threats. Threats of violence against election workers, formerly almost non-existent, are now frequent. District attorneys and judges involved in prosecuting Trump are receiving threats. Threats against members of Congress are on the rise. Armed actors at protests are becoming more common. Hate crimes are increasing. White supremacist group activity is on the rise. Mitt Romney, in his new book, reports that a Republican congressman wanted to vote for Trump's second impeachment, but chose not to out of fear for his family's safety. So what is the impact violence and threats of violence? Harassment, intimidation, and threats of violence can be used to deter potential opponents from engaging in public service or to pressure current officials to resign. Election officials are retiring and resigning as a result of threats of violence. The loss of experience among election officials leads to an increase in errors, and more human errors in a partisan environment leads to further erosion of trust in our electoral system. Extremist groups are mobilizing against an ever-increasing set of enemies, such as those on the previous slide, as well as healthcare workers, teachers, librarians, reporters, and school board members. Our government and communities are finding it increasingly difficult to recruit candidates and retain staff. And violence tends to lead to more violence. For example, 87% of the people arrested on January 6th were not part of a violent group, such as the Oath Keepers or Proud Boys. Generally, they came from large cities and the surrounding suburbs, but viewed violence not as a criminal act, but as political behavior. The increase in political violence is making it less safe to participate in protests. For example, since George Floyd's murder in 2020, 139 drivers have driven cars into protesters. Prior to that, there had been only 3 instances. There is a growing acceptability of paramilitary groups in political activity as they show up at rallies and provide security for political events. Another significant aspect of the rule of law is the debate surrounding the indictments of ex-President Trump. Some see these accusations of wrongdoing as an expression of the idea that no one is above the law. Others believe that law enforcement has been politicized and weaponized to pursue him. Historically, new administrations have gone out of their way to avoid pursuing the previous office holders. We all remember how Gerald Ford pardoned Richard Nixon, and President Obama chose not to prosecute members of the Bush administration who had authorized the unlawful torture of detainees. While no ex-president has been indicted before, no president has ever left office with so much potential criminal liability. Putting him on trial for his conduct would be equivalent to putting on trial the more than 72 million Americans who voted for his re-election. But giving him a pass says that the president really is above the law and above accountability. The stakes of prosecuting Donald Trump are high. It could further inflame the partisan divide, even to the point of civil unrest. If a prosecution is viewed as illegitimate, could it undermine confidence in the rule of law, whatever the outcome? What if he is prosecuted and acquitted? Would it look like the prosecution was unwarranted? Would it set back future efforts at presidential accountability? Prosecuting him would mean convicting him. And are we ready to send an ex-president to prison? But not prosecuting him also sends a dangerous message. What would it say about the country's commitment to the rule of law? If we find Trump used the power of his office corruptly, and we fail to call those actions criminal, then we are saying that he is above the law. Could that embolden future presidents to do whatever they want? Other democracies seem to be able to prosecute their formal leaders. Examples of Jacques Chirac, Nicolas Sarkozy, Silvio Berlusconi, and they have done this without dissolving into civil war. But most of these were for simple corruption, plain old graft. None of them have ever been accused of trying to overturn an election. But now the die has been cast, and Donald Trump is facing a number of federal and state prosecutions. The peaceful transfer of power. The peaceful transfer of power has historically been the norm in the United States. The losing party in every presidential election willingly and peacefully relinquished power to the opposition up until 2020. For the first time, we had a taste of what happens when citizens lose confidence in the electoral process and fear an election has been stolen. I'm talking about the events of January 6, 2021, when citizens descended on Washington to disrupt the counting of the electoral votes that would certify the election results and make Joe Biden the president. Political scientists tell us that the perception that an election was stolen is a major instigator of political unrest and violence worldwide. Now we know the United States is no different. What makes this so difficult to address is there's no objective proof that there was anything wrong with the 2020 election. As we discussed earlier, multiple investigations have all concluded the election was secure and fair. So what do we do about citizens who believe the very fact that their candidate lost is the proof that there was something wrong with the election? What is the impact on democracy when one side believes there are only two election possibilities? Either their candidate wins or the election is fraudulent. And what do we do about elected leaders who echo this belief when violence is a potential outcome? Right now, these are questions without good answers. One more short topic for today, and then we are done. Human rights and liberties. The U.S. has done a great job documenting citizens' rights and liberties in the law and establishing the institutions to defend them. The challenge has been extending these rights and liberties to ethnic and cultural minorities. As much as all men are created equal, is in the Declaration of Independence, even the founders did not really consider that phrase applied to anyone but themselves. It has been contested over the years by those who believe there is a natural hierarchy that puts white Christian men at the top. Indeed, wealthy Southern slavers were pretty sure the founders had made a terrible error in their insertion of equality for all. Their great truth was that white men were a superior race, and even within that race, some men were destined for lower menial class. This idea continues to find expression in modern society as white supremacy, but the phrase continues to inspire those marginalized groups to demand that America fulfill its promise of equality for all. Clashes between groups who are descended from different ancestors or who worship a different god has historically been one of the main causes of violent conflict, state failure, and even civil war in many, many countries. In this context, Diversity is actually a stumbling block to a peaceful society. Earlier, we talked about tyranny of the majority. Rule by the majority has served to inflame violence between ethnic or religious rivals and to deepen the exclusion of minority groups. To keep the peace, most democracies established a tradition of minority exclusion. This is what the United States did after the Civil War. The political stability of the period between the end of Reconstruction and 1965 was rooted in a compromise, which permitted the South to deal with Black people without Northern interference. That is the implementation of Jim Crow. This racial exclusion contributed directly to the civility and cooperation that came to characterize 20th century American politics. The 1964 Civil Rights and the 1965 Voting Rights Act would at long last fully democratize the United States, but would also polarize it, posing the greatest challenge to establish norms of mutual toleration and forbearance since Reconstruction. Today, we are engaged in a great experiment. We are trying to build a multiracial democracy that will endure and treats minority members equally and fairly. Unfortunately, there is little precedent for this, and the historical record for such an effort is far from optimistic. The most celebrated democracies, such as Athens and Rome, took pride in their ethnic purity. Governing was restricted to an ethnic in-group. And the most successful diverse societies, like 9th century Baghdad and 19th century Vienna, tend to be empires and monarchies where all citizens were mistreated equally. That is, the relative number of your group members did not impact the laws you were required to follow. We have a significant portion of our population that is highly disturbed by the increasing diversity in our society. Many white people worry that their social position is being degraded. Those who seek power and do not value the idea that all are created equal and deserving of having a say in the running of the government find appealing to the status anxiety of white people a useful tool in advancing their cause. The overarching question we are faced with is, how do we as a multiracial democracy sustain a common national identity that overcomes the divisions inherent in diversity itself? Without an answer, our democracy is at risk, but there seems no clear pathway on how to accomplish this. This is where we will stop for today. Remember to return your 4x6 cards to the envelopes in the back. We'll see you next week.